Just remember to turn them on.
I was like, filters.
Okay.
Filters.
In terms of the volumes.
You want to put water? It's like-
Okay. So, Isabella, would you come sit with us at the front? Or do you prefer to sit here?
I'll wait here.
Okay. Okay. Very good.
All right, so I think we're ready to get started. Thanks everyone for your patience, and thanks. My name is Megan Stevens, and I'm the co-chair of the Women's Advocacy Group here at Holy Blossom. And we helped to organize this event tonight. The microphone's not on.
Yeah, it is.
It is?
Keep going. Pavel's got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds better. Okay. It takes the magic touch. So my name is Megan Stevens. I'm a co-chair of the Women's Advocacy Group here at Holy Blossom. We are so excited about the event tonight. It is amazing to see a room so full of people, which I think is a real testament to our need to feel connected to community, and also the draw that we have in our amazing guests tonight. So it's wonderful. Also, we know there are many, many people joining us online. So the one great thing emerging from COVID is the way we can all connect virtually. I personally have people who've reached out from across the country who are logging in tonight to join us. So I also want to specifically recognize some of the special guests who've joined us here tonight in person. MPP Dr. Jill Andrew, and I believe MP Yara Sachs is also joining us tonight. I also want to thank the women of Holy Blossom who have generously not just sponsored the event tonight, really helped to coordinate with volunteers. The desserts are all thanks to them, really getting the show going. So thanks so much. And then, of course, I really also want to acknowledge where we are tonight. Holy Blossom Temple is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Nishnabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And we know Toronto, or Tekaranto as it's sometimes known, is covered by the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, but I recognize that the signatories to that treaty certainly came from unequal positions of power, and that's contributed to the problematic history of colonialism that we are now really challenged to confront. So as we head into tonight's discussion about the work of women lawyers fighting injustices across the US, and how the themes that Dahlia Lithwick draws out in Lady Justice are also reflected here in Canada, I'm going to be doing some thinking about the work I can do to address the systemic challenges of colonialism in Canada, and in particular, the pernicious impacts it's had on Indigenous women. So I'm grateful tonight for the opportunity to gather together on this land, strengthen our community, and help our speakers shine a light on our collective responsibility to advocate for social justice. So I want to now introduce the three incredible women who will be part of tonight's discussion, starting with our guest of honor, Dahlia Lithwick. So Dahlia is a senior editor at The Slate. She's been writing their Supreme Court dispatches and jurisprudence columns since 1999. Her work has appeared in really all notable US media, the New York Times, Harper's, the New Yorker, and the Washington Post, among others. She is the host of Amicus, which is one of my very favorite podcasts, and it's won awards, It really focuses on the law and the Supreme Court of the United States, but she brings amazing speakers who have such insight into what's going on at that court, which right now feels like we should all be paying attention to. Dahlia's also appeared on CNN, on ABC, on the Colbert Report, and The Daily Show, and she's a frequent guest on the Rachel Maddow Show. Not surprisingly, she has received numerous awards for her work, including the American Constitution Society's Progressive Champion Award. Who wouldn't want that award? That's amazing. And the Hillman Prize for Opinion and Analysis. Her book, Lady Justice, was published last semester. It quickly rocketed up to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and if that's not impressive enough, was #1 on Oprah's list of the best fall nonfiction books of 2022. And it certainly made my list of top reads for the year. We are so privileged to get to hear from you tonight. I am so delighted that when I reached out as a cold call, having found a friend who had your email address, you were so incredibly gracious about joining us. So thank you so much for your generosity of time. So while Dahlia and her book are certainly our centerpiece tonight, she's going to be joined tonight in discussion with Holy Blossom's own senior rabbi, Yael Splansky, as well as the Honorable Rosalia Bella. A truly worthy introduction to Justice Abella and all her contributions to law and justice in this country would really take the rest of the evening, or in fact has been the subject of multi-day conferences since her retirement from the Supreme Court in July of 2022. My time is short, so I just want to pause briefly to recognize Justice Abella as the truly great Canadian she is. Indeed, she's a powerful reminder of how so many of Canada's best come here as refugees. Justice Abella was born in a displaced persons camp in Stuttgart, Germany on Canada Day in 1946. She came to Canada as a refugee with her family in 1950. And then in 1976, at the age of 29, she was the first refugee and the first pregnant person ever appointed to the bench in Canada. She was later elevated to the Ontario Court of Appeal, where I was lucky enough to get to know her as a law clerk back in the year 2002 and 2003, the year I was actually converting to Judaism, and she was a big support of that process. In 2004, she was the first Jewish woman appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada. She has received 39 honorary degrees, maybe more since that list was put together, and countless awards for her work, including a coveted award from this temple in 2019 when she was given the Rabbi Gunter Plaut Humanitarian Award. So Justice Abella, many of us miss you on the court in Ottawa, but we're really thrilled that you're joining tonight for this conversation. Finally, very briefly, while she needs no introduction to many of you, I want to thank our senior rabbi, who is saying, don't do this, but I want to thank her for her leadership on so many fronts, particularly in relation to issues concerning gender equality. It was not long after she moderated a discussion that we asked her to moderate last fall about the state of reproductive justice in the post-Dobbs world that she suggested we invite Dahlia to come speak with us about her book. Rabbi Splansky, we're all looking forward to celebrating your 25th anniversary at Holy Blossom later this spring, but tonight we really welcome your leadership in this discussion. So with those, with those intros done, I'm going to invite Dahlia up to speak about her wonderful book. She's going to start us off, and then we're going to have this discussion where both Rabbi Splansky and Justice Abella will quiz her with questions, and then we're hoping to leave a little bit of time for questions from all of you towards the end, and then we're going to move into the book signing and dessert reception. So thanks so much.
So I want to start by saying, I think both my aunts are watching on Zoom. Hey. I really want to start by thanking Megan and your team, Holy Blossom and your team, the bookstore, different book list who showed up to sell some books tonight, my children's orthodontia thanks you. And most of all, I gotta say, I've been covering the United States Supreme Court for, we're gonna lower it because I'm on my tiptoes. I would have been on my tiptoes for an hour, easy, thank you. I covered the US Supreme Court. This is my 24th term covering the American Supreme Court, which is like not bad for a good Jewish girl from Ottawa. But if you had told me that I was going to get to meet Justice Abella tonight, my head would have blown off. So this has really been, for me, like a singular opportunity to get to be in conversation, both about the book and about some of the, I think, really urgent existential issues that I'm covering every day around the US Supreme Court. And I also would be remiss if I didn't thank all of Camp Rama in Canada from all of the 80s for showing up in force to prove that you can be friends with people for decades and decades, despite doing some really dumb stuff at Camp Rama in Canada in all of the 80s. So my topic tonight is nominally my book, Lady Justice, which, as you heard, just came out in September. The sort of subtitle of my talk is Why I Wrote a Little Pink Book About the Law. It's extremely pink for those of you who are encountering it for the first time. But more broadly, my topic tonight is women and power and law and the rule of law and the justice system, and how one can begin to think about a legal system that is simultaneously the instrument of equality and dignity and justice and fairness, and the instrument, as you just heard, of terrific oppression and violence, and still is today. And I started this book in 2017, and I was watching, after Donald Trump was inaugurated, the ways in which women lawyers in particular seemed to kind of spring into action regardless of what they were trained to do or how they thought about the law or what they thought they would be doing in the Hillary Clinton administration, because they all thought they were looking at a Hillary Clinton administration, and the ways in which they turned instantly and started doing what I thought was really important legal work, often in the trenches, frequently unrecognized, usually in huge teams, often teams of other women. It wasn't anything that I had ever seen before, and I thought it was dramatic and worth writing about. And I should note that all of the cases that I cover in the book are cases that I was covering as a journalist in real time. In other words, I didn't know how some of these were going to turn out. And years later, in fact, even post-publication, we have codas on some of the stories that I wrote about in the book that are not wins, that are very frustrating, which we can talk about. But I really was trying to think through what I thought was a question about this, what I call special relationship between women and the law. And I wanted the book to be a little bit of a meditation on this question of, are women good at the law? Are they different at the law? Are there ways in which the law, which is a thing that doesn't require, big fists, it doesn't require, power, it doesn't require anything other than the ability to do deep research and show up with your yellow pad and hopefully win, is there some way in which women are uniquely suited to the kinds of victories that I was seeing? But I want to be very, very clear that when I started the book in 2017, and I had no idea what was going to happen both in the Trump administration and in these cases that I was covering, I turned in the very, very last draft of this book 4 days after the Dobbs decision came down on June 24th of 2022. And so I want to be completely transparent when I tell you I wrote huge swaths of this book in those 4 days, because it was very clear to me that a book about how women always win, spike the football, we shall overcome, don't worry, if we just lawyer up, we will prevail, seemed a little dumb in the summer of 2022. And one of the things that is really threaded through the book is this deep anxiety about what it means to respect and revere the law and the rule of law and courts and constitutions and justice systems, and also to have those instrumentalities turn on you and suddenly do horrific, shocking violence to you. And how can you still believe in and reify a legal system that can turn around and make sure that today, there are women in prison in Alabama because of their miscarriages. Today, there are women bleeding out in emergency rooms in Texas because they can't be given the kinds of emergency interventions for which a doctor would be on the hook. So what do you do when the law is both, as Homer Simpson famously says of beer, the cause of and the solution to all of your problems? And I just want to tell you, I actually had one opportunity in my life to brief then Justice Anthony Kennedy of the U.S. Supreme Court on, at the time, one of the travel ban cases. And for reasons that I cannot reconstruct today, I told him that Homer Simpson quote and told him he was free to use it about anything. The First Amendment, it's the cause of and solution to all your problems. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, it was never deployed by Justice Kennedy in an opinion. Okay, so the most meta thing that I realized as I was putting this book together was that if there is a special relationship between women and the law, if unlike the kinds of street fights that we've had for most of history to achieve power, the law gives us access to power simply by being smart and thorough and diligent and good in it. What do we do when the law kind of turns on us? What do we do when the law is the thing that is making people suffer? And here I just want to say, as I said in my opening, I've covered the U.S. Supreme Court for 23 years. I'm still probably one of the youngest people on the beat because nobody leaves this job. It is the best job in the world. But I have watched, just in a very, very compressed amount of time, the median justice on the U.S. Supreme Court go from Sandra Day O'Connor, right, centrist Republican appointee who was pretty much down the middle on most issues, to Anthony Kennedy, slightly less centrist Republican appointee who nevertheless persistently throughout his career had a soft spot on affirmative action, on LGBTQ rights, even at the end of the day on reproductive justice. And the median justice today is Brett Kavanaugh. The median justice is no longer Chief Justice John Roberts. He was the median before Amy Coney Barrett came in the court. He is now irrelevant. He sometimes votes with the liberal bloc, but he is no longer steering the court because the entire court is directed at Brett Kavanaugh, who is one of the most, historically in the last 100 years, one of the most conservative appointees we've ever had. So all that happened in a really tiny amount of time. And what that means for somebody who believes in the rule of law and stare decisis and the idea that precedent has force and that there is a predictability in law that is necessary in order to order your lives, we essentially went from 2016, the whole women's health decision reaffirming the core holding of Roe v. Wade, to Dobbs in 2022, eviscerating the core holding of Roe v. Wade. That's how quick it turned. And I'm here to tell you, I think most Americans still haven't integrated how quickly that turned. That was a shocking, shocking reversal that most people, I think, still haven't quite come to understand how that's going to affect their lives in their court. So one of the things that was another sort of big theme for me in the book, and this is the slightly grumpy part of the show, is where I say that part of why I wrote this book was that I have covered the Supreme Court long enough to see the cult of Ruth Bader Ginsburg at its ascendancy. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young women who thought that fighting for reproductive justice meant getting mugs and T-shirts and earrings and throw pillows. And to be sure, my friends, I have the mugs, I have the earrings. You can come to my house. I have all the throw pillows. I have a little votive candle that I light on, special occasions. But this was not reproductive justice. And the notion that we were pouring all of our hopes and dreams for gender equality into one person, and that we were therefore off the hook from doing the work ourselves, came to be, in my view, one of the real dangers in thinking about reproductive justice and reproductive freedom. It is just not enough to show up on the steps of the US Supreme Court in a pink hat once every 5 years and think you are doing the work. And so when I pitched this book, I had more than one publisher say, and this is the book that I think Justice Abella was terrified she was going to see, why don't you just do another biography of RBG? Why don't you do more hagiography about this one woman justice? Which is great, because Nina Totenberg's book is that, and it's fantastic. But what I wanted to say is that for every RBG, there is a Ruth Baby Ginsburg doing the work every day, and that the Ruth Baby Ginsburgs are all around us. They always have been, and that we do the cult of celebrity around a single justice at our deep peril. And I was really afraid to write a book that was more or less, fan fiction to any woman justice, when it was clear to me that there was, at the same time that we had an RBG, there was a Polly Murray. So now here's when everybody goes on screen save and says, but Dahlia, who is Polly Murray? And what I want to tell you, and this is the introduction of the book, is that but for a handful of historic accidents, Polly Murray could have been RBG. Polly Murray is the most important constitutional and legal architect that no one has ever heard of, ever. And I went to law school at Stanford and learned 0 things about Polly Murray, and nobody is taught about Polly Murray. So just briefly, for folks who don't know, Polly Murray was the granddaughter and great-granddaughter and great-great-granddaughter of slaveholders on one side and slaves on the other. And she was not allowed into the University of North Carolina because she was black. She was not allowed into Harvard Law School because she was a woman. Polly Murray, I should be very clear, would probably want to be identified as they today. Polly Murray was without a doubt gender nonconforming before there were words for that. But Polly Murray, who fought her way into Harvard Law School, who was one of a tiny handful of people at Howard Law School, wrote a paper in which she said, I'm just spitballing here, but I wonder if we could use the 14th Amendment to do away with race discrimination in schools, and people laughed at her, and one of her professors stuck it in the file. That paper was pulled out later by the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP. Thurgood Marshall argued Brown v. Board on the spine of Polly Murray's work, and nobody credited Polly Murray ever. Polly Murray finds out years later, oh, that paper you wrote, that wacky paper? Yeah, no, that was actually Brown v. Board. Polly Murray goes on to write and to litigate some of the most important gender equality cases, getting no credit. Polly Murray refuses to move to the back of the bus long before Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of the bus in Virginia, but Virginia decides not to press charges. Polly Murray's desegregating lunch counters before it was cool to desegregate lunch counters. Nobody's heard of Polly Murray. Polly Murray, when Richard Nixon was casting around, theoretically, for his first woman justice, Polly Murray wrote him a letter and was like, Dear President Nixon, I've got someone, me. I should be your first woman justice. Needless to say, Nixon did not oblige. But Polly Murray ended up doing exactly what she did in Brown v. Board for gender cases as well. Ruth Bader Ginsburg eventually, when she brings the seminal gender discrimination case, puts Polly Murray's name on the brief. Polly Murray did not work on the brief, but at least credits her with, she's the architect of all of this. And so as I say in the book, Polly Murray kind of clawed American constitutional equality, both on gender and race fronts, out of the rock face of nothing, and history has forgotten her. And so for me, the book starts with Polly Murray because Polly Murray could be anyone. Polly Murray is everyone. And some people get credit and some people don't. Some people get tote bags, some people don't. But my book, I really was important to me for the book to be lifting up the Pauli Murrays all around us and to say that it's really easy to be mad that Ruth Bader Ginsburg didn't retire when she should have and could have been replaced by Obama, and it's all her fault. But blaming Ruth Bader Ginsburg for ruining everything is the flip side of the coin of thinking that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was going to fix everything. It's the same problem, cult of personality, instead of doing the work. So what I really wanted to do when I wrote this book was not just lift up Robbie Kaplan, who fought the Nazis in Charlottesville and won, Becca Heller, who fought the Muslim ban, Sally Yates, who refused to enact the Muslim ban when she was acting Attorney General, Nina Perales, who's doing redistricting work, Stacey Abrams, who invented a ground game in Georgia that has revolutionized the way people vote. I wanted to lift them all up, but I also wanted every single person who knows somebody in law school to say to them, you too are Pauli Murray, you too are RBG. It's not going to work to just buy the throw pillows. It's going to have to work to all of us get in the trenches, roll up our sleeves, and fix it ourselves. So the last thing I wanted to say before we turn to our panel is that one of the most interesting things for me, through lines in the book, is that every single lawyer I interviewed in their chapters comes down in a totally different place on this question that I started, the framing question of, is the law my friend or my enemy? Is it, to quote Homer Simpson again, the solution to or the cause of our problems? And every single person that I interviewed comes down in a totally different place. Becca Heller, who's young and brash and sassy, essentially says, forgive me, I know I'm in a synagogue, the law is bullshit. I am using the master's tools to take apart the master's house. If I could have been an orthodontist, I'd be an orthodontist, but I'm a lawyer, so this is what I do. Robbie Kaplan is much more apt to speak in lofty ways about the arc of the moral universe being long, but bending toward justice. Anita Hill, the most improbable person to believe that the law is immutable and bending towards a better place. Anita Hill is the person who says in the book, without law, we have chaos. Without law, it's just street fighting, and I can't win, and vulnerable minorities can't win. So my job is to take the law in all of its myriad imperfections, in all of its bias, in all of its built-in systems and structures of oppression, and to melt it down and build something better. And to hear Anita Hill, who has, I think it's fair to say, been wronged by the American legal system, say that, for me, very much maps onto where I landed in this book. It was, to be sure, exhausting and depleting last year to cover first SB 8, the Texas vigilante abortion bill, where you could get a $10,000 bounty for turning anyone who not only provided somebody an abortion, but who aided and abetted, which included giving advice. That's how the year started last September. By the time we got to the Dobbs oral argument, where it was clear for those of us watching the oral argument that Roe was going to be over, by the time we got to the Dobbs leak, an unprecedented leak that we have never seen the likes of in American history, and then Dobbs itself, it was really easy to say, this whole system is irretrievably broken, and I'm out. And bring on the street fighting, because this is not fair or just or right for women. But I come down, despite all of that, and as I said, despite the mayhem of rewriting the introduction, the conclusion, and the abortion chapter in the book in the span of 4 sleepless days, I come down firmly of the view that there is no plan B. And that in countries right now where the rule of law is crumbling, you can see it around the world, and in that sense, we are in a scary moment. Plan B is the army. That's not good. And so what I'm going to urge all of you to think about and do as you engage with this book is think very hard about the ways in which the women on the streets in Iran, The women in Saudi Arabia who are being faced with horrific oppression don't have access the way we do in this country, the way Americans do, to the levers of the law. What they have is their body on the street. We have women justices, we have women judges, we have elected representatives, we have women, 50% of law school plus are women. We have the access to the machinery that women around the world would kill for. And so we can't fall asleep. We can't say that is immaterial. We have to re-up, we have to fight, we have to support deeply and with every fiber of our being a legal system that is riddled with flaws, to be sure, but it is better, as Anita Hill says, than chaos. And it is better than what we are seeing around the world. So I'm just so deeply honored to be with you. I want to say one thing before I call up my interlocutors. I'm terrified of one of my interlocutors. So I'm going to drag this out as long. I know it. I'm going to drag this out as long as I can. But I want to just end with, I always do this having said bullshit in a synagogue. I want to end with one little word of Torah, which is my favorite. Having said, I'm a little bit worried about Ruth Bader Ginsburg hagiography, but I want to say one thing that she taught me about Tikkun Olam, repair of the world. I think we tell a story of Justice Ginsburg where we say all those early cases in the ACLU Women's Rights Project, she was so sneaky and clever because she found men, plaintiffs who were facing sex discrimination, right? So men who couldn't collect benefits in the military because their wife was the person in the military, men who couldn't take time off to care for their widowed ailing mother or for their children, right? That was like her party trick, right, at the ACLU, was that she found men and then brought cases to court saying, look at these poor guys, they're the victims of horrible sex discrimination. And the way I learned that story was, look how clever and sneaky she was, right? Because she was standing in front of all male panels and she wanted them to empathize with men who were being denied benefits based on gender stereotypes. That's not how Justice Ginsburg ever told that story. And I love the way she told it, and I want to share it with you. Justice Ginsburg told that story from a deep place of believing that we would all be a better world if men were allowed to take care of their ailing mothers, if men were allowed to take care of their children after their partner died, if men were able to have a spouse serving in the military and be at home. It wasn't a zero-sum, look how sneaky she was getting benefits for women by getting benefits for men. She genuinely believed that we would all rise up if men could have fully realized ethical, professional, emotional lives that were as complicated as the ethical, professional lives of women. That, to me, is the heart of how she thought about Tikkun Olam, or repairing the world. It's not, I get this so you don't. It's not about scarcity. It's about everybody being a little bit better for having a more capacious idea of how we work together. And so my little tiny teaching that I offer you is that I am looking, particularly in this term at the US Supreme Court, at an ethos of scarcity in the affirmative action cases, in the voting rights cases, in the Indian Child Welfare Act cases. Every single one of these cases is about, if you get a thing, I don't get a thing. And I think that's a horrible backward way to do both constitutional law and to do, I think, Tikkun Olam. And so I want to urge you to think deeply, deeply about the legacy of RBG, not as a party trick where she got all sorts of benefits for women by pretending that she was helping men, but as somebody who deeply believed that by helping men, she would help build a better world. Thank you very much. So what a gift, my goodness.
true and also hopeful. Let's start with the personal. Dahlia, you talked about writing this book as an intellectual meditation. You had some questions that you wanted to find the answers to. But I wonder if you could also speak about what the process was like for you in the midst of how the world was falling apart or seemed to be falling apart. Was this writing this book, was it a kind of therapy? Was it a kind of Torah for you?
I mean, I think like a lot of people, am I being
You're good.
heard? Okay.
You're good.
I think probably like a lot of people, I can say I would not have written this book but for COVID. COVID was an amazing 2-year opportunity to sit in my basement and weep. And weeping in your basement gets super old. So then I had to finish the book. I think one of the things, and I guess I'm very curious what Justice Avella thinks about this, but this is what happens when you have a podcast, right? You immediately take the question and reframe it. But I think I had been covering the court. In all the years I covered the court, there were 2 women justices. For the first part, it was Justices O'Connor and Ginsburg. And I was obsessed with this question of women in law. I couldn't put it down. I wrote a big cover piece for Glamour magazine about it. I was just obsessed. Do women do law differently? And if so, how? And then when it went down to one justice, and it was only Justice Ginsburg on the court, she changed in a lot of ways, wrote differently, thought differently, and then I was super obsessed with this question of women in law. And I think one of the things that animated the project of the book was always in the back of my head was this question of, are women different in the law? Why? How? What is that relationship? And I think for me, I don't know if I would call it Torah as much as I would call it just this urgent question that I was trying to find an answer to. And one of the things, and I say this in the chapter about the travel ban, when Donald Trump signed the executive order that put the travel ban into effect, and folks may recall, within 2 days, every airport that had an international arrivals gate had lawyers standing there, like crazy people with yellow pads, right? And signs in Arabic and Urdu saying, I'm a lawyer and let me help you. And in San Francisco at the airport and at SeaTac, people were chanting, let the lawyers in, and I was like, this will never happen again. Like, they hate us. And if this is happening, what's going on? And one of the things I noticed, and I wrote this in the book, is overwhelmingly, even though they were real estate lawyers and they were tax lawyers and they were divorce lawyers, it was women at the airports. And that, for me, triggered this. And as I say in the book, too, and I will finish my answer now, but as I say in the book, too, 4 of the 5 judges who enjoined the travel ban in the first day were women. And so already there felt like there was a template for some answer to this question that I had really been struggling with. So I think it was, to the extent that that was my Torah, it was this question of, what if women are super good at this and nobody's written a book yet?
I don't have a throw pillow yet.
It's in the mail. It's in the mail.
You are our Lady Justice.
It's in the mail.
Yes. Do you think there's a special relationship, a unique relationship between women and the law?
That's such a big question. I was thinking about that as you were talking. First of all, let me say to all of you that when Rabbi Splansky invited me to do this, something that had been on her mind, I think, for a good 48 hours. Sure, I can do it on short notice. As it happens, I have nothing to do. But I'm dying to meet Dahlia Lithwick. She sent me the book. Not a lot of time, 2 days to read a book. And I thought I'll read a chapter or 2 just because I've always admired Dahlia Lithwick. She is among the finest legal journalists in the world, let alone covering the mess that is the United States. And I sat down and I started reading it and I couldn't put it down. It's one of the most absorbing, readable, intellectually satisfying books about what lawyers do. And my pride was that these were great things that lawyers did, and they happened to be women lawyers. So, you know, in 1970, when I graduated from law school, there were 150 lawyers, and 5 of us were women. So we were constantly being asked, what does it feel like to be a woman lawyer? What difference will women lawyers make? What difference will women judges make when we started to appoint women? And interestingly, we appointed the first woman to the Supreme Court of Canada in 1981, the same year Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed. And it was a huge deal for us because there had been almost no women judges. When I was appointed to the family court in 1976, family court, there were no other women on the family court. So what happened was we watched Sandra Day O'Connor, but we didn't stop. So in Canada, we've had 11 or 12 women on the Supreme Court. It's a big deal that you've had 4, right? Whoa, 4. And I love going to the States because they say, boy, Supreme Court of Canada, how many judges have you got? 9, just like your 9 judges. So we can name every single one of their 9 judges. Nobody, even in Canada, can name ours. But to go from 5 women in a class to suddenly knowing that the law schools are 50% women, I don't know what it was like when you went to Stanford, means that you have created an environment where you've normalized the participation of women. Normalized in the sense that everybody understands that you can be a lawyer if you're a woman, which is a radical shift from laws, not girls aren't lawyers. Are we the judges at the top? Yes. Are we the managing partners of the law firms? No. Are we doing some important litigation? Yes. Are we doing as important litigation percentage-wise as men? No. So what makes me nervous is we take enormous comfort rightly and pride in how many women there now are. Some of them are fantastic, some of them are okay, some of them aren't very good. And in the early days of the women's movement in Canada, people used to say, we'll know we have equality when women have the same right to be mediocre as men have.
Are we there yet?
No. We're not as mediocre, we're differently mediocre. So it makes me a little bit nervous to say women are changing the profession because some women are. Some judges who are women are. Some men who are judges are, and some of them were more feminist than some of the women, especially in the early days. So I kind of grew up nervous about the gender labels that came from the expectations that you put on, this is what women are supposed to do, this is what men are supposed to do. But what I've come to now, Dahlia, and I'm interested in your view, I have such a wistful sense of the failures of the legal system, the failures of law. You talked about the Iranian women. What's the point of having a law? I mean, what's messed up in the United States is that they don't understand what justice is. They have no problem with making laws. They're good at rules, but they simply don't understand justice. But we have laws that prevent exactly the kinds of things that are happening around the world to women, including the women in Iran. It's on paper. That's the rule of law, and yet it's happening. So I wonder, what's the point of having laws or rules if they're not enforced? What comfort do we get from the existence of these words on a piece of paper and the fact that there are a number of great lawyers and judges who are promoting it, when around the world there is no acceptance of what rule of law even means? What does that mean? Why do we use the term? Hitler had a rule of law. Segregation was a rule of law. Apartheid was a rule of law. Why do we keep using a term nobody understands? We know it means democracy. So we should have a rule of democracy. But we're afraid because who are we to impose on other countries our sense of the world? So I think we've become too tentative about the values that we started this generation with. We're proud of our achievements, like more women, LGBTQ, we've included more. Canada has a trajectory, Dahlia, that went from conformist, everybody's the same, that means no women, no Jews, no blacks, no indigenous people. It's been ever increasing until more and more and more people are included. And when we change precedent, it's to include more, not what the Americans do. So I'm proud of what we've done, but I am terrified that we have all these contested terms, like democracy, like rule of law, like justice, like what the role of the courts is, what should a Supreme Court do? And we're not going to be able to solve our problems unless we figure those things out. And what's missing? Leadership. In the legal profession, in the political environment, and globally, the world is falling apart, and everybody's moaning, and everybody's groaning, and whatever happened to law, whatever happened to courts. And we have a luxurious discussion about, are we getting enough women getting to do enough important cases? So I love that we're in that position here, but I am terrified at how law has let the world down.
Do you want to respond?
As a Jew,
Yeah.
it bothers me more because we had the Holocaust, and what are we doing about what's happening to other people?
We have in the room tonight many lawyers and some judges, but most of us are ordinary citizens. And Dahlia, you say in your book, the law is about citizens, not lawyers. So I think your book should come with a warning label. If you read this book, you will want to get up and do something. So what do you recommend we ordinary citizens can do to be a part of the extraordinary project of democracy?
I think you just heard Justice Abella lay it out, probably better than I could, which is we cannot fall asleep at the switch. I think we believe that we have the luxury of not caring about the rule of law. And part of that is, the parochial, it's not happening here, so I don't have to worry about it, right? That's global warming. It's part of the, I'm super busy, someone else is handling it, thank goodness we have, people who are in charge of this. And I think, and this is something I'm not sure has fully sort of been integrated in Canada the way it was in the United States, but it's incredibly important that that travel ban happened as a lawful measure. It is incredibly important that the Donald Trump Justice Department said that if you are a teen migrant at the border entitled to have an abortion, you can't leave the shelter because that's the law. I think that we look away and we say, like, not in my backyard or whatever it is, I want what I have and I'm not going to worry about the world. And also I think that, and Justice Isabella said this too, it feels as though the problems of the world, if you think about Hungary, if you think about Ukraine, if you think about what's happening in Israel this week, it feels so intractable and beyond any solution. And I do think that part of the answer is leadership, and I think that one of the things I have absolutely felt in my bones in the last 10 years is I don't know where the clarion moral voices are. I don't know where they are. Thankfully, I've got some amazing rabbis in my life and amazing clergy generally who I think have been the voices of moral authority. But I have been just staggered, particularly in the United States, at the sort of transactional, you get this, we get this happens, you happen, careerism, and the ways in which, one of my unfalsifiable reverse engineering of history is I think constantly about how Martin Luther King and Heschel were friends of the heart. And what that friendship between the most improbable partners, both of whom had been traumatized and scarred to the point that it's amazing that they could see beyond their own pain and see their friends' pain. And what they were able to do together and find community and to lift each other up, where's that moral leadership. And I say that as somebody who's a huge fan of Elena Kagan, and I think there's lots of incredibly important leaders doing important work. But I think that it's become sort of passé to talk passionately and soulfully about what is right and what is wrong and what is good and what is bad and what is a lie and what is true. And I don't know that when I look at my teenage boys, I don't know that they're growing up and hearing those clarion voices. And I'm not sure where to point them to. And so I don't know if that's an answer about what we do, but I think that in this room, there are a lot of Polly Murrays. And there are a lot of people who can dig deep and find ways to be leaders and who are just hoping that things don't get a little bit worse. And I have, friends who do these studies on democracies in decline. The United States is in decline as a democracy in a profound way. And I don't know if sitting around and waiting things to get worse before we act is a super good tactic.
You mentioned Dr. King, and he's being remembered this week, of course, across America. And he came to speak here at Holy Blossom Temple in 1965. And my grandfather introduced him to his teacher, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. So there is a quote of his that I love about power and justice. He says, what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. Yeah, we miss it. We miss his voice. Cornel West similarly says that justice is what love looks like in public. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, each of you, if you could talk about if you think justice work is a labor of love, is an expression of love. Where do you see that today? You go first.
Oh, I don't think anybody gets involved in the justice business, and I include the media, people in public service, lawyers, judges, rabbis, anybody who's committed to the public on behalf of justice, because lawyers don't own it. And believe me, there's so many disconnects between laws and justice that no legal community is going to say, leave the justice to us. It's everybody's business. But I think there's an underlying problem. When I listen to the quote that you gave, or I think about the speech, I have a dream, or the arc of the moral universe bends always towards justice. I think the reason we don't have that anymore is because we no longer have a sense of love towards the public, each other anymore. It's become such, led by the United States, which whatever they want to say about how we're just one of many countries, America is America. There is American exceptionalism. What you do matters. We don't follow your judgments, but we follow what is happening in the country. And I think when the United States falls apart, as it has, on what speech means, what religious tolerance means, what gender equality means, what tolerance generally means, people get confused everywhere around the world. So I worry about this aspect of justice, that everybody now, because of what's happened in the United States, through the United States Supreme Court, everybody says they have the right to be the determinant of what justice means to them. I don't care what the court says. I don't care what the government says. My rights, my liberty is the right to be and do anything I want, and I don't care about anybody else. There is no magnanimity, no sense of ownership as being part of a public interest. That's gone. In the United States. And because it's gone in the United States, and because you can't have an argument about anything, you're left wing. I mean, we used to be called middle of the road. Now we're left wing because everybody's so right wing. You're a socialist, and it's playing out in Israel. Labels are taking the place of discussions and arguments. Nobody's listening, everybody's talking, and there's no way to get an understanding of getting past the labels, past the formulas, and sitting down to fix, because nobody understands the same sense of what it means to fix. So if you ask the people in the United States who voted for Trump, they thought he was fixing it. My question about the United States is, how did it ever happen that all these lawyers had to do the things they did, because the laws they were passing were outrageous, demonstrably outrageous? So how does that happen, that happens to a society? You know what I think? Too much justice. Too much sense that everybody can do whatever they want and say whatever they want. And I think it's become so ridiculous that you can have what happened in Charlottesville, as your book brilliantly points out, or Skokie, and not say some things are not okay. If you've got a society where people are afraid to say that's not okay, where instead what they say is, it's up to you, that's your right to feel differently. We were brought up with, no, there are values that are okay. There are answers that are right answers. There are answers that are wrong answers. And you're not being biased or activist because you believe in the right values. And yet, who's on the defensive? Who's on the defensive? These lawyers like Becca Heller or all of those other people, they're the ones having to explain what they're doing, not the people who are passing the laws that are outrageous. So I worry. I think we're in turbulence. Canada is lucky so far, but some of the things even that I've seen happen in Canada, I would not have expected to see 10 years ago. So I think vigilance is one thing. You have to be on guard and not be afraid to say, no, that's not right. That's not good for a country. Because every country that's gone the way of the United States now has ended up with squishing rights. And when you squish rights, you squish justice. And what's the point of law if the law is used to squish rights?
Maybe we've come full circle to Justice Abella's, I think, justified anxiety about sort of essentializing about, women lawyers or women in the law, because I think one of the things that felt true to me as I was working on the book, and also as I was thinking about some of the women lawyers, was that they had in their muscle memory, whether it was, Justice Ginsburg always used to say, she remembered driving around as a child and everything posted on all the businesses in upstate New York said, no dogs, no Jews. That was just burned into her memory. I think that this paradox of the law as being this agent of terrible harm and violence, and also possibly the agent of more democracy and repair, is something that if you are, and it's not just women, if you are LGBTQ, if you are any vulnerable minority, if you are differently abled, you've been code switching between those two worlds your whole life. That you know that the law is both something that made you deeply vulnerable and also that has given us this reprieve to take it for granted. And maybe part of my answer to why, Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel were so good was that code switching of their own experience of the law being weaponized against them and the law lifting them to freedom. And maybe that's part of the answer to this question, which I think is the right question. What do you do when, in Virginia, my home state, for 20 years, they've just banned a list of books, a huge list of books, banned. How is a child going to learn about anything if they can't read it in school? And so I think that part of what you're describing and it is very much from an entrenched view in the United States particularly of rights as determinative. Because if you think only through this lens of rights, it's my right, you get Kyle Rittenhouse, right, shooting up protesters at a Black Lives Matter rally and being acquitted because it was his right, right? This is castle laws in the United States and stand your ground laws that hold that if somebody comes into your house, you are entitled to shoot first and ask later. That's your right. SB 8, the vigilante bill I talked about, I have the right to determine who is aiding and abetting an abortion, and I have a right to collect $10,000 for turning them in, right? So this culture of vigilantism, you are the determinant, you are the arbiter of what the law is now being baked in at every single level of government. And I think you're exactly right. The more you reinforce the idea that the law is what you think it is, and if you happen to be waving a gun around and there's a home intruder who's your babysitter, so be it. And I think that that has absolutely been acculturated into the bloodstream of how Americans think about rights as determinative of freedom. And anyone who went to law school probably remembers, like Hofeld, right? This, with rights there come responsibilities and duties, and those two are paired, and we don't talk about responsibilities and duties. So just to like dovetail with your original question, I think part of, and it's why I talk about the scarcity thing, because I think if you are creating legal regimes in which if someone else's kid gets into Harvard, yours doesn't, therefore affirmative action is bad, or somebody else gets to adopt this indigenous child and you don't get it and you want a child, so therefore you challenge the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is on the docket this year. Every one of these, if somebody votes in Alabama and they're Black, you don't get a vote. That scarcity, that ethos that everything is coming to take stuff away from me, married to this rights as a value, I think is what is kind of taking us really precipitously downward. And I think the answer is, you're exactly right, to reconstruct and refashion a notion of justice that comes not just from a place of scarcity and loss and anxiety about people taking stuff from me all the time, but from a place of duty, responsibility, obligation, and yes, love.
Before we open it up for questions from the crowd, I wonder if we can name some of the undercurrents here in Canada that we should be watching, paying attention. You said you've seen the last 10 years some worrying changes. So what are they? Let's name them.
I can talk quickly, and then I want to hear what the expert says. But I covered the truckers last year in Ottawa, and I was really stunned by how an idea that was funded by, designed by, the signs were produced by, the GoFundMes were originating in California and Oregon, often in like creepy white supremacist enclaves. Some of my friends from Charlottesville who marched on my town were the engineers of that. So I think what was stunning about that, and maybe this undergirds some of what you were answering, how quickly a fundamentally American complaint about COVID, about public health, about, again, these definitions of liberty and freedom that had nothing to do with Canadian notions of liberty and freedom, wholesale, boom, glued on to Ottawa and repeated verbatim. And it was really interesting being there and covering it, because I could have been covering Charlottesville. So I think it's some of the rhetoric, some of the slogans, a lot of the money, but how quickly foundationally, deeply American notions get grafted onto Canadian public discourse. And that, to me, as somebody who kept saying Charlottesville could never happen in Canada, that was really staggering how quickly that took root.
That's exactly what I meant when I said what happens in America matters everywhere. We don't have plexiglass at our border. And I remember in Canada in the 90s, You know, our Supreme Court, when we first decided the Charter of Rights and Freedoms cases, people were so happy that we finally had a Supreme Court that was aggressively protecting rights.
Excuse me, can you just turn your mic on? Yeah, so we can hear you. Or I can.
I hate technology.
Okay. Can you back up 2 sentences?
Someday
Is that on?
No go?
Keep going, keep going. Pavel's coming. Okay, the expert is coming.
How many people can't use a mic for God's
It's not you. It's not you.
In the 90s, after a decade of Canadians cheering this Canadian Supreme Court, Bertha Wilson, Brian Dixon, the lawyers will know the names of the heroes. They can't hear? Here.
No, it was the other way. I'm sorry. Try now.
Oh, is this on?
Okay.
Do you want me to sing again?
Yes. The men I love.
Someday you'll come. So we had a decade in the 80s where Canadians were so excited that we finally had a Supreme Court that was like the American Supreme Court in the 60s, the Warren Court. It was muscular, it was fearless, it was bold, and suddenly we went from being a Supreme Court that decided constitutional questions about was the egg marketing board part of federal or provincial jurisdiction, to having a Supreme Court that was really actively protecting what the rights in this new Charter and freedom, rights and freedoms were. No tentative steps, we went straight bull. I had nothing to do with it, I stand on their shoulders. But suddenly in the United States, there was a very conservative movement led by people like Orrin Hatch and Tom DeLay, remember the exterminator from Texas, who started screaming about the American Supreme Court and about activism and politicization, terms we had never heard in this country. Suddenly, in the 90s, when the Supreme Court was talking about gay rights, when it was talking about rights of the accused, differently constituted Supreme Court, we had a different media. I mean, let's not make any bones about the fact that what the media promotes as being the right way to go is influential. I mean, they have the right to say it, but it's influential. So you had this perfect storm of American influence, Supreme Court decisions that were protecting rights the public wasn't sure anymore it wanted protected, and an American rhetorical supply side movement of language that we had never heard before. In other words, the courts are not legitimate. It took us about 20 years to recover from that, and it stopped in the United States in 2000. They stopped using the word activism at Bush v. Gore. Why did they stop using the word activism? Because activism got them a president. Okay, we don't think it's a bad word anymore, so they stopped using it. But then they started using other language like socialist and left, these presumptively dismissive terms. So I get very nervous about the willingness of some people in Canada to look to the States for leadership when everything about what the United States is doing is destructive of everything this country values. The truckers were marching under the banner of liberty, the American. We don't have that notion. We don't say liberty means clogging the capital of our country for 3 weeks. That's never been our definition of liberty. We don't say liberty means the right to carry a gun, the way the American Supreme Court does. We don't say liberty means saying anything you want about anybody, anytime. The Americans think everything is okay. We don't have Fox News. Am I allowed to say that? Oh, it's so good to be retired. So we don't have a lot of those immediate influences, but it doesn't mean that there aren't people who are tired of the way we are being required to treat other people sensitively, generously. They don't, suddenly the word diverse has become a little bit of a bad word, and instead you hear words like woke. When I was coming into the legal environment in the 70s and 80s, we used to say, isn't that great? We're now including all of these people. Suddenly, people who are being, as you say, being excluded because other people are being included, we're using the word woke. That shuts down the conversation. Well, sometimes it's woke and sometimes it's really good what's happening. But instead, we're not grappling with the issues because it's so much simpler the way the Americans are doing it. So I am nervous. I'm not that nervous because I think we have a good press in this country. I think we have a good a wonderful legal profession. We have a terrific judiciary in this country, but we're normal. And people who are scared, and people are afraid now that they're not going to have access, or their kids are not going to have access to what they had access to, will cling to things that they wouldn't otherwise have clung to. And the first thing that tends to go when people see other people getting things they wanted and they can't get, the first thing that goes is generosity. And when generosity goes, it's often replaced by anger. And when anger starts to take over, then you're not in the world of the rational anymore. All of that is, I think, remote in Canada, just because the roots, I think, are so strong. But there are, that truckers thing was a wake-up call, not a woke-up call.
Nope.
A wake-up call to show that it was possible. But we had a royal commission immediately. There's a Court of Appeal judge who's coming out with a report. The whole thing was aired publicly, and it will be addressed. But should it have happened in the first place? We all said, we were in Ottawa at the time. Is this Canada? And it was because there were people afraid to say, this is not okay. But Canada's a country that says this is not okay. And that's why we're better. We are better. Yeah.
Okay, so now we can open the floor, and I'll just remind you that a question is something that ends with a question mark. And if you can form your question so it's nice and tight so that we can hear from the experts up front. Okay, Eric Rohr.
Super.
Yeah, so folks at home can hear.
Very brief question, and you would have been covering it, affirmative action. And I'm very worried about what's happening in the States and the makeup of your universities. As Justice Abella said, what happens in the US matters, and that kind of philosophy can spill over here. What's your view about the current status of affirmative action?
So the U.S. Supreme Court, although this is settled precedent and has been for decades, the U.S. Supreme Court took on 2 affirmative action challenges that they heard this fall, one from the University of North Carolina, which famously would not give a place to Pauli Murray, and the other from Harvard. And that's because one is a private school and one is a public school. One is a statutory challenge, the other is a constitutional challenge. The reason the court mushed them both together is that Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is the newest justice, sat on the board of overseers at Harvard, and so she was recused. And so the court took them together so she could be on the UNC case. The incredibly dispiriting answer is I don't think there's any question based on oral arguments, and any Supreme Court reporter will tell you, take that with a grain of salt. Things change in conference, although on this court they don't change much in conference. But I think it's fairly clear that affirmative action, as justified under the long-standing justification for affirmative action in American constitutional theory, is not reparations for past harms. It is so that you can create diversity in the classroom, and that's been the standard for decades. At points, Justice Clarence Thomas was saying, I don't even know what diversity means, explain diversity, it has no meaning. I don't think that I counted 5 votes to save affirmative action. And I think one of the things that was deeply worrying, and I talked to Sherilyn Eiffel, who was the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund until last year. I talked to her, I think 2 podcasts ago, and she made the point, and I had missed this, that in one of the challenges, it was claimed that this was discriminatory toward Asian students. And so it was racial animus and discrimination against Asian students. And she pointed out, and a lot of us who covered the case closely missed it, there was no evidence in the record, none, not a lick in the lower court opinion, that there was, in fact, discrimination against Asian students. And she used this as an example of the sort of wholesale importing of fake facts into what then becomes oral argument. So I think the last thing I'll say about this is in the states that have done away with affirmative action like California by ballot initiative, we've seen minority enrollment in higher education plummet. We know how this will end. So they will get rid of, I think, affirmative action in both those cases. And then I think you're just going to see American universities, private and public, scrambling to find some other way to have a diverse class, to have all the benefits of the pipeline into leadership that is, racially diverse, but they will not be able to use, I think, going forward, race as a factor.
So this raises probably one of the most fundamental differences between Canada and the United States. This case was a made-up case. The group that brought it at Harvard was a group, they just quickly formed on behalf of Asian students. There was absolutely, as you just heard, no evidence at all that the Asian students were suffering. They won in all of the lower courts. The United States Supreme Court rarely used to take cases if there was no dispute in the lower courts. But here's the main problem, I think, with the United States approach to affirmative action compared to Canada's. The United States is built on a political DNA that is based on the individual. Every individual under the American Constitution has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Individual. Their notion of equal is everybody is the same. What does that mean? If you're in a wheelchair, you don't get a ramp because you have the right to be treated like everybody else. So the same means hegemonic, male, the system's designed for the people who are who have easy access into the system. Canada is based on a notion of equality which says you have the right to integrate based on difference, based on your membership in a group. And that's because French English, we came together as two groups, and so you can be equal and you can be different. We don't have any problem with affirmative action. So they don't get the idea of difference. So treating race and acknowledging that race can keep you out, hello, means that you are discriminating. They think, most astonishingly of all, that every distinction is discrimination. What? Every distinction is discrimination. So Roberts famously said at the end of the Kentucky and Seattle case, to get past racism, you have to get past racism. And racism means taking race into account. What Harry Blackman said in the Backey case was, to get past racism, you have to take race into account. So there's a wide disparity of understanding about what equality means, what individual rights means. They hate group rights, so they hate group remedies like affirmative action, and they think they're being fair. So their whole notion of what is fair is ridiculous because it's built on an assumption that everybody is the same. So under that authority, women are treated like men. They used to have a case, Godello,
Mm-hmm.
woman who was pregnant, didn't get the benefits because she wasn't discriminated against on the basis of
sex, yeah.
sex. It was because she was pregnant, and she was treated like all pregnant people. So we stopped looking at the American jurisprudence when Rehnquist became the Chief Justice. And it's really sad, but affirmative action, the notion that they are doing a genuine jurisprudential exercise into whether or not it's a good idea or a bad idea is nonsense. They are doing this to get rid of affirmative action. plain and simple. Otherwise, I have no opinions about this.
Thank God for retirement.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, Rabbi Splansky. Thank you for having
being
me
here.
tonight. Justice Abella, it's great to see you again. As the sole legislator in the room and the Parliamentary Secretary to Families and Children,
Member of Parliament.
Member of
RSX.
Parliament. I'm the sole legislator in the room tonight. No? One behind me.
Dr. Ann.
Provincial. There we go. Even better. Apropos Roe versus Wade and what Justice Abella said just tonight about there isn't a plexiglass. As a legislator, and as a woman, I'm challenged to say, well, how do we protect what is a right almost by omission? Abortion is access to health care in this country. It is, which is great. And it is not criminalized here. But we've seen time and again efforts to do backdoor legislation that women have fiercely fought in the chamber against. But there's an interplay between judicial activism and what folks like me who come into the chamber fiercely advocating for the rights of women, children, families, our communities. And I guess the question to each of you is, when faced with a challenge like this one, where Canadian constituents are looking across the border and wondering, is the sky falling here? My question is, what would you expect of someone like myself or someone like my colleague just behind me? Are we listening and legislating? Are we listening to our judiciary and legislating? Is it a combination? Is the activism coming from the community, from the courtrooms, and from the chamber? How do we marry that relationship in a time where having the hard conversations are nearly impossible to have? That's my question. It's a tough one.
You want me to go first? Yeah. This is one of those places where a couple of things. I think that this is one of those places where I think what Justice Abella said, which is there are very, very deep differences between jurisprudence in Canada and the jurisprudence of the United States. And this is one of those places where I think it's really important to understand that there has been a 50-year campaign to overturn Roe, and with that, a campaign to overturn marriage equality and even birth control, which we are seeing absolutely happening, right? We have pharmacists at Walmart who are filing suits saying, I'm not dispensing the morning after pill, I'm not dispensing birth control, Plan B, Ella, I'm just not dispensing it because of my religious liberty claims. That campaign has been decades in the making, and I'm not sure it has an exact analog here, although I'm willing to be corrected. I think one of the things that I worry about deeply is how inflected the conversation about reproductive freedom, birth control, women's rights generally is with religious doctrine in the United States. You cannot read Dobbs without understanding that to be, at bottom, a deeply Catholic opinion with markers laid out about life beginning at conception and ensoulment, and a whole campaign to think about this through a deeply theological lens. And I think it is to the great shame of the United States Supreme Court press corps that we did not cover it that way. And we can talk someday about why we didn't cover it that way, but I think this is a unique moment in the United States where you are seeing a real juggernaut of claims about religious liberty, right? It starts with Hobby Lobby. It starts with this year, 303 Creative, there's a case before the Supreme Court about a person who is a web designer who doesn't want to provide services to a hypothetical same-sex couple that have yet to seek her services because, by the way, she's never done a wedding website before. And this goes to your invented facts point. But this is going to be the marquee religious liberty case this term. And I think that there is, in a really deep and unacknowledged sense, a huge conflation of theological claims and constitutional claims happening in the conservative legal movement in the United States that I don't think, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is dialed up to 12 the way it is here. It's not funded, it's not resourced, it's not, the seeds of these ideas have not been planted the way they have been there. And so I think initially I would say, you know, in some ways this is apples and oranges. In other ways, I think, and this is my sort of grim answer to you, I think that we are looking at a worldwide revanchist view of women and liberty. And it is not just the United States, it's not just Iran, it's not just Saudi Arabia. I think we are living it through a moment where the backlash against women's freedoms is like nothing that I have seen, certainly in my lifetime. And I think that the conversation, to the extent we can think about it, is to really center the idea, do we want to go backward? Do we want to go back to a world in which women are less free? And this was Justice Abella's point too. Dobbs was the first case in American constitutional history that reversed precedent in order to take away rights, right? Do we want to be less free? Do we want to give dignitary humanitarian interests less salience than 20 years ago? And I think that's the conversation to have. And I think one of the huge sort of failures in the public discourse around Dobbs was we got really, really focused in on abortion. Dobbs is not an abortion case. Dobbs is a case about bodily autonomy, family autonomy. Dobbs is a case about birth control. Dobbs is a case about if Dobbs go, then the next thing to go is Obergefell and marriage equality for same-sex couples. And I think that, and it goes to the like sloppiness of the United States Supreme Court press corps, to which I cop, the sort of myopic coverage of Dobbs, I think really precluded having that huge aperture of what else is at stake. And that's where I think a smart country thinking about rights and freedoms would start from there and not from women in Texas can't get an abortion. That's not what Dobbs is about.
I agree with all of that. You know, this is a classic question, the relationship between the courts and the legislatures, and it's pretty easy in Canada because we quickly came to the view, as did most of the democracies, you make the laws, and we then decide in a constitutional democracy whether those laws are compliant with the Constitution. You are there responsive to the majority. We are there responsive to the public interest, but not necessarily the majority. And we don't go to the polls every 4 years the way you do. So the risk for us, the reason we have independence and tenure until we're 75, is so we can be unpopular and make the decisions you can't make without risk. That plays out a little differently in the United States, where they think majority means democracy. They don't have any understanding at all. There's a checks and balances. It's the courts do this and the legislatures do this. And that's what's going on in Israel now too. Democracy means the majority rules. No, it doesn't. And if you read the Federalist Papers, it's about different institutions playing different roles. You are responsive as a legislature to the majority, and the risk is non-election next time. But courts are there permanently to oversee the constitutionality. Are you doing it within legal limits? We may not be right, but that's our assigned role. And when you have a situation, as you now do in the States, where the government is offside our understanding of what decency and morality and rights mean, and the court is offside what decency, morality, and justice means, where do you go for relief? I mean, I think there's no place to hide in the United States. So in Canada, if there's a law people are concerned about, they go to the Supreme Court. If the government hates what the Supreme Court did, they do have the notwithstanding clause. not a fan of the notwithstanding clause, but I didn't say that. I didn't turn off the mic.
Yeah, you did.
But they don't have that in the States. All they you know what they have in the States? The press, the academics, the lawyers, the people who speak. But those traditional institutions of democracy, like courts and the legislatures, have been hijacked by people who care about neither. And that's the problem. So thank God for Delia. I mean, what would you do without her?
That's right. That's right. So I know there are many more questions. We're watching the time. And I think we'll turn to conclude. Yes? There was one more.
We have a couple of questions. We have one and one that I saw.
Okay, we have to keep it really tight.
I think we were going to call it a time for now, and then.
Okay.
And then
So let me say this, and then I will introduce Cheryl. We are in a synagogue tonight, and to set the Jewish frame, one of the 613 mitzvot of the Torah is tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice shall you pursue. And that's a very strong verb, right? Many other verbs could have been included there. Justice you shall admire, justice you shall protect. Justice, justice shall you pursue. That you need to chase after it, and that it is a constant pursuit. We might not capture it ever, but we are constantly running in its direction with urgency. And that mitzvah, of course, is not only for the elected officials, not only for the lawyers and the judges. That mitzvah is assigned to each and every one of us. So thank God for the judges and the lawyers and the journalists and the scholars who model for us how to pursue justice. Really, thank God for you. But let us not forget that it is for each one of us to fulfill. Cheryl Sylvester is one of the co-chairs of our women's advocacy group. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Rabbi Splansky. Wow. It's such an honor to be able to say thank you to this panel tonight. You've really brought us tremendous wisdom and insight and lots of challenging things to think about going forward. So thank you so much for that. Dalia, thank you in your book for shining a bright light on women's legal leadership in the ongoing challenges with the movement toward and hopefully toward greater democracy and justice. We have made a donation to thank you to an organization called Women on Waves, an organization supporting reproductive justice in the U.S. at the suggestion of Brendy, who works with you. So that's to thank you for your generosity and in sharing your wisdom with us tonight. Justice Abella, thank you for gracing us with your presence tonight. We admire your deep wisdom and your deep experience and sharing it with us tonight. Thank you. And Rabbi Splansky, thank you for always lifting up Torah and Jewish values and inspiring us in the pursuit of justice. It was already in my notes. So I think I've been a good student of yours over these years. And the repair of what is broken in this world. You inspire, all three of you have inspired us to live our democratic and Jewish values more fully. So thank you for that. I want to thank the women of Holy Blossom for their sponsorship of this evening's event, including the live stream and the reception. Women of Holy Blossom represents and advances the interests of Jews who identify as female, and Women of Holy Blossom is an affiliate of Women of Reform Judaism. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Here at Holy Blossom Temple in person, thank you for being with us. And on our live stream tonight, thank you so much. I'm confident that you are as inspired by these incredible women and their work as I am. For those in the room, we can take the first next step in our own action, toward democracy with the purchase of Dahlia Lithwick's book from our local bookseller. A different book list, our neighborhood bookstore up on Eglinton. And so Dahlia will be signing books over in the corner. And in honor of the panel tonight, we've already purchased the first book and will donate it to the Temple Library so that, that others can benefit from this wonderful book. Light desserts, tea, and coffee are here in the room. And thank you to Women of Holy Blossom for their, and particularly Corinne Black and the other volunteers for the team who's put this together tonight. And if you're still at home, grab yourself a tea or coffee and take some action online. Buy a book, listen to the podcast, and we invite everyone here and at home to follow Dahlia and Lady Justice, Holy Blossom Temple, and Women of Holy Blossom. Follow us all on social media. Check out the holyblossom.org website for upcoming events. Good night, everyone, and may our individual and collective actions lead democracy from strength to strength.
One of the things that really bothered me about